in the Woodward Midtown area, but we, unlike other places, we have a free-for-all in this state of, you know, go wherever you feel like and we'll take care of things for you. We really need more incentives to pull people in. Those are a few components. What would you add?
Well, I had been talking previously from sort of a regional perspective, and I'll say something on that as well, that other metropolitan regions have bought into the idea that the central city is important for the entire metropolitan region. When Detroit suffers, so does the entire metropolitan region. We haven't done as well in Detroit as other metropolitan places in finding ways to cooperate across municipal boundaries. So decisions about transportation and economic development are harmed when we only plan at the local level. So when Detroit is competing with Southfield, is competing with Ferndale, et cetera, to draw in new economic development, that's harmful when instead we can work together in terms of transportation and particularly education. When a large share of the region's children are not being educated because of poor school systems, that hurts the entire regional economy. So part of the issue is a political question of how we begin to cooperate. Yeah. What else would I say? Very much related to the political question is the ability to raise revenue question. So we are so tied to raising revenues at the local level based on property taxes that the municipalities that are hurting the most are precisely the ones who can't address issues because they can't generate enough revenue. And so, again, regional cooperation is a way of getting past some of that. And we have examples of that elsewhere. In Portland, Minneapolis has a tax-based sharing system, for example, recognizing that some places have a harder time generating revenue than others. So that's another way of thinking about that question.
Yeah, and just going back to one of the slides that I put up, this the land use task force, or the land use recommendations that were being made, the one where I said there was only a few of them had been passed, essentially, those were addressing the whole issue of urban revitalization, and they did not pass. It's sort of a huge tragedy, I think, for the state of Michigan. And those were fairly mild recommendations that were made. There's actually a webpage you can go to, the People and Land webpage, the Kellogg Foundation maintains, which kind of keeps a running tally on what were the recommendations and how many of them were passed and how many weren't. And basically, they updated it a year ago and it hasn't been updated since, but I think between that year and maybe 2 years before, there'd only been a couple of things added. So that has drastically slowed down since 2003. So I think part of what's happening is we need to educate the people of the state to see cities as important and to support some sort of action at the state level, because without that, we aren't going to see any action that can really support these things. And we can talk about things that need to happen within the cities, such as the city of Detroit or the city of Flint, but the regional context is so, so important. One more thing I'd just like to say is that, again, the research in other places is showing that those where urban revitalization happens, which is part of your question, where does it come back? Where do we see essentially at least property values that have maintained some sort of high level over a period of time? We're still asking that question. Those are actually research questions. But some of the initial studies have suggested that the greater the urban containment, the more stable the status of the central city. And urban containment can be growth boundaries. It can be essentially service agreements. It doesn't have to be just a boundary like the Portland. There can be many variations of this, so we have a lot to learn in terms of that.
Well, they're following up on that. There's an IBM commercial that says for the first time in history more people live in the cities around the world, but in Michigan, half the population are in the townships, including myself. I can't buy milk without getting in the car, sort of thing. But just to follow up, you know, the regions that have been successful, was there a tipping point? Was there a crisis? It's like here in Michigan, we all know what we're supposed to do. We all know it works. And I know the economic conditions are just kind of spiraling downward. What is it going to take to get something to move? Is there going to be a crisis or you know, a lightning bolt striking the Capitol and the legislators will suddenly be enlightened, or what makes it move? What makes it happen?
Well, first of all, it hasn't happened that many places for us. But one place that has happened, we've mentioned several times, Minneapolis, St. Paul. And I'll just say something about that, and then maybe you could talk a little bit about Cleveland, you know. But basically, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Myron Orfield used to be a very popular speaker here in Michigan. I haven't heard of him coming recently. I don't know if, Gary, you have or not, but his whole sermon was essentially the suburbs have to get together with the central cities. And the specific suburbs that need to work together with the central cities are the older suburbs, which are beginning to see the same kinds of problems that used to be in the central city. And he actually put together a coalition in Minnesota. He was a state legislator. He put together a coalition of the central cities with the older suburbs, with the townships and the far out areas that were essentially seeing the new population but not the new revenue. And they passed legislation that essentially they needed to kind of improve things at least a bit. So that's one example of where something happened. So I don't know if you want to talk about Cleveland.
No, Cleveland
No.
doesn't really have a regional approach.
No.
Yes. Well, first let me say I came in late, so I missed part of the presentation, but I'm curious as to what can be done about investors that buy properties and just sit on them and let them rot. I mean, is there any precedent of what other cities have done to try and prevent that from happening? I'll give you an example. I've been trying to buy a house, and so I'll go around, I'll drive around the neighborhood that I'd like to buy a house in, I'll see a for sale sign, and I'll call the number, and the people on the other end will tell me that the house sold 9 months ago, but it's just sitting there, nobody lives there. Do you have any comments on that?
Yes, that's a common issue in areas of our cities, and it's very common both in residential properties and commercial properties. And other states have been adopting legislation to enable cities to take certain actions that cities here, as far as I can tell in talking to various lawyers, you can't take yet. So for instance, in Washington, D.C., they raise taxes by a large percent each year that you have a vacant property you just sit on. So it's something like 10% increase per year, so that it quickly becomes very large. In other places, you have to register your vacant properties and explain why they're vacant. There are good reasons for some to be vacant, but in many cases, there are these people who are just holding property and deterring reuse. So I think there's a lot this state could actually do, but right now, cities can't at the moment do that much because the enabling legislation is lacking. So there are people that I work with the Detroit Vacant Property Campaign. They're working on that, on what kinds of measures to recommend, working with CDAM, the Community and Economic Development Association of Michigan, and others to try to feed some legislative proposals in for dealing with those things.
In some of your presentations, you showed clusters that sort of indicated that the, quote, city in the region, in the six-county region, has moved to essentially maybe Southfield or beyond, to the point that if you started looking at economic activity and connectivity and all of those things, you showed a periphery where the people had more difficulty, whether they were